Hello, and welcome to Libero, the podcast about the least important of the most important things, as the Allo Allo star Gordon Kay once said. I'm Rory Smith of The Observer and Men in Blazers, and before we get to today's episode, this is the bit where I have to remind you to leave us nice reviews and positive ratings on whichever platform you choose to listen to us on. We recently reached the giddy heights of 80th among all podcasts in the UK, and some of those are truly dreadful. It's gone to our heads a bit, and now we're aiming higher, because that's how market forces work. On with the show. The show which today involves what Jack Pitt-Brooke, one of our own, described on our WhatsApp the other day as both our smuggest and most chin-stroking lineup. I might leave a little gap there, so you can guess which people he might be talking about. And maybe that's why this is the first time this lineup has ever actually done Libero together. The lucky winners of that description are James Horncastle of The Athletic and Jonathan Wilson, author of the recently released book The Power and the Glory, A History of the World Cup, which I'm actually meant to be reviewing for The Observer but haven't got around to yet. I'm sure it's very good. You should probably buy it anyway. It is available in all good bookshops, right, Jonathan?
And several bad ones as well, I'm sure, and Amazon and all that kind of place. Don't want to oversell it, but it probably is the best book ever written or sold.
It's it's one of two World Cup books that have recently been published, and I would, having read neither of them, recommend that one. Given it's a World Cup international break, as you'll have noticed, and Wilson's got a book out on the World Cup, we thought we'd ignore that completely and do something else entirely, because we're not here just to advertise Jonathan's other revenue streams. So instead, we're going to talk about a subject that's become a bit of a theme for us as we kind of plan episodes, and that is what counts as cutting-edge tactics in what increasingly looks like football's post-Pep Guardiola world, which will offer some reassurance to anybody, because it is still going to be a Wilson episode. So we should probably start with kind of defining what we mean by what we're moving on from, if that makes sense. The things that have counted as football's best practice for, I would say, the last 15 years at least, maybe 17, if you date it back to Guardiola being appointed as Barcelona's main men's team's head coach. What do we think those central, core tenets of elite football have been since that point, Jonathan?
Well, I think 2008, when Guardiola takes that job, is it is a threshold. So if you look every Champions League season up to 2008, look at the knockout stage, average goals per game, only go above 3 twice. Look at every season since until 3 years ago, and it's only below 3 once. So suddenly football becomes much more attacking at a simple level. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think pitch technology is huge. I think changing the laws, changing the offside laws so that the effective playing area is bigger, crackdown on intimidatory tackling. It allows a more technical game to develop. Guardiola comes into the perfect environment for his football and absolutely capitalises on that. And suddenly everybody realises if you're really good, you can have 70-75% of the ball. People a little bit later realise you can win games with 25-20% of the ball, 19% if you Jose Mourinho in the semi-final, which you actually lost, but you won the tie as a whole. And so that, I think, is a huge change in the mentality. Now, what we actually mean by Pepism, I think, is quite complicated. We've touched on this before, that it's almost such a broad church that it's meaningless. It's like Peronism. You can have a left wing of it and a right wing of it who will hate each other. But fundamentally, it's a development of total football. It's football based on pressing, on possession. And I think although Guardiola himself has evolved significantly, it's always fundamentally based on control.
Yeah. It's also based on telling your opponent that they are so good. And that you will learn from Russell Martin. Yeah, I mean, in preparation for this, I looked at a book that had come out in Italy in around sort of 2011-12, which is called I Hate Tiki-Taka. And it was a polemic, and it was dedicated to all the counter-attackers, all the contropiedisti in the world. And it did make that point about being patronizing, Rory. Particularly the kind of environment in which Guardiola comes up in Barcelona, calling themselves, more than a club, putting UNICEF on their on their jerseys. It was too politically correct for some Italians.
So the move to Qatar Airways presumably has been a great relief.
Yeah. So I mean, look.
There is something in that though, James, isn't there? Because it has felt, and I'm going to caution here. This isn't like another Pep episode. We're going to try and take this in a different direction. We have talked about Guardiola at length before. You should absolutely go back and listen to whichever number episode that is. It's got Pep Guardiola in the title. But it did kind of codify that idea that I think has always existed in football of there being a right way to play. And Jonathan will, at this stage, will probably be thinking bilardismo, menotismo in Argentina. I think even if you look back at the 80s, that kind of the culture club and the crazy gang kind of delineation between the Liverpool way of playing and kind of long ball football. This has been like a perfect storm for 20 years of there being like a correct way to play football and internationally standardized. This is what you should be doing if you are morally right. And anyone who kind of acts as a heretic to that has been seen in a little way as being kind of the bad guy.
Yeah, I think that's true. And yeah, again, as we touched on that Pep episode, we fall instinctively into using religious terminology. I mean, you just used the word heretic. That is partly because it's the language in which they themselves speak of it. Guardiola saying, Cruyff built the cathedral, our job is to maintain it. The way Xavi is so sanctimonious about teams who dare to defend against his sides.
This podcast does not like Xavi Hernandez. That's one of the messages that's coming through.
I mean, magnificent footballer. Let's leave it there. So I think that is true, and I think it's really interesting what Thomas Tuchel was saying over the weekend, that he wants to have more long balls, more long throws. He's going to use every tool in his arsenal. But what I found weird wasn't so much he was saying it, because it just seems to me, use whatever you've got, doesn't matter. If you think that's the best way to do it, great. It's the tone he took was sort of, I feel like I need to justify doing this. That there's a sense that long throws are like somehow cheating. And then it's sort of, I mean, they ended up sort of fusing together, but coincidentally, I looked up the last time England had played in Belgrade, which was the game in November 1987 when they beat Yugoslavia 4-1. One of their greatest ever results. I think certainly first half, you'd say one of their greatest ever away performances. And you look at that game, it is incredible how direct England are. The first goal is just a long punt, like a 70-yard punt. A sort of punt you never see from goalkeepers now, from Peter Shilton. That the Yugoslav defence are just sort of, what? No, Peter Beardsley scored. Then there's two corners, and then there's sort of an indirect free kick, but it's caused by a long diagonal into the channel. And you sort of think, God, English football in the 80s, even Bobby Robson, who we sort of think of as being fairly sophisticated, God, he coached in the Netherlands, he was coach at Barcelona, he must have known what he was doing. And yet that football was a lot more direct, a lot more physical than we sort of now think of as good football. And this, I mean, James can maybe give a bit more perspective on this, but I sort of feel in England, it's been a very easy, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but I don't think it's entirely right either, but it's been a very easy way of explaining England's underperformance at international tournaments as being, we're too long. We've got to learn how to hold the ball. That's what the continentals do. The good sides, they keep possession. And of course, there is something about the temperature at World Cups. So it is harder to play that full-on hell for leather football. But it does baffle me slightly that the thing English football has always been good at, we're saying, we've got to actually play them on their terms. We're going to ignore what we're good at. And that I think is that sort of instinct among a certain constituency of people who watch football, talk about football, write about football in England, so maps quite closely onto Guardiola, which is possibly why we were so eager to embrace that in a way that your man who wrote I Hate Tiki-Taka Football clearly wasn't.
Yeah, although Guardiola's emergence in 2008 I sort of corresponds with the kind of twilight of Italian football being great, if you like, in terms of winning the World Cup a couple of years beforehand. Spain knocked them out in the Euros in 2008. And then even though Inter beat Pep Guardiola's Barcelona to the treble in 2010, it's clear that the tides of history are behind Pep and his way. And so with that, there has been a lot of maybe we should adopt their approach. I remember Cesare Prandelli's Italy, kind of being branded Tic Italia because they dared to pass the ball and hold on to the ball. And over time, you've had a bit of a backlash to this, more of a backlash than I think we've seen in England. In part because Pep has obviously come to England, and it seems like, wow, look, he found it tough for the first year because it's different here. And then it was kind of like, well, he's really good, isn't he? And we're all learning from him. Whereas in Italy, there's been this sense that, okay, let's try and adopt what he's done. Oh, actually, no, this is to our detriment. It's been our ruin. This is the big soundbite that Chiellini gave a few years ago, which he's had to clarify, where he said Pep Guardiola has ruined football. And what he meant by that, it wasn't an attack on Pep. It was an attack on Pep's imitators and the people who were trying to implement the ideas that Pep has got without the players that Pep has got, without being able to adapt those ideas to different teams, different players. And, particularly in Chiellini's case, sort of defenders being expected to do more with the ball, which, actually, guys, get back to your fundamentals, man mark, just enjoy defending, don't try anything too complicated. And so, it's a curious arc that we've been on. But I mean, to go back to, I suppose, Jonathan's point at the beginning of this, I've always thought that Pep Guardiola represents this kind of Steve Jobs sort of messianic figure where, sort of the iPhone is now so ubiquitous. Almost everyone, apart from those weird people with Google Androids, they have an iPhone or they have a Mac or something like that. And the idea that you would go back to using Nokia and playing Snake is just like, you are some kind of weird technophobe. Like the idea that you would use ideas that were, very fashionable in the past and have kind of fallen out of fashion, when those ideas are still applicable in certain circumstances. There's a weird resistance to it, which I think Tuchel was kind of touching on, and we saw when Pep met Warnock, didn't he? There was all this kind of stuff about Pep having his sort of tea with Warnock. But it never felt like a meeting of minds. It was almost like sort of think, well, you'll never guess what Pep's meeting his absolute diametric opposite. When in actual fact, a lot of things that Warnock brought to the game still very much applicable when used with the right personnel in the right context in the right circumstances. They're not things that should be just kind of thrown in the bin.
Yeah, I remember doing Rafa Benitez's autobiography, ghosting it, and being really struck. It was the first time I'd ever really spent a lot of time with an elite manager, and being really struck by how much of his sophisticated tactical thought. Because in the same way as the others discussed last week, like Arsene Wenger inventing pasta and broccoli and not drinking before and after games. Rafa was, along with Jose, was one of the first people to really do tactics and to be unapologetic in England. Obviously, there had been tactics before, but Rafa seemed to be. It was kind of that age of the Tinker Man in Ranieri, and Rafa seemed to be kind of one of these people who was unapologetically saying, I am moving these people around like chess pieces. That is the way that football works. It is in my brain, and then the pitch, what happens on the pitch is kind of a manifestation of my vision. But a lot of Rafa's tactics were like, be really narrow in defence and get more breadth as you attack, compact, tight, mixture of man marking and zonal marking. Like it was very much like you've got to win the second balls. Even in this, and this was like 2011, I guess that I was writing it, even in what we thought of as being like the cutting edge then of, or close to the cutting edge of like foreign tactical thinking, Rafa Benitez talked a lot about second balls. And you can go and watch Sunday League football and people will shout seconds because they know that football is about winning your duels. That is what football is. And I think a lot of this strikes me that in Italy, particularly, and I wonder if Italy actually, rather than England, would be the most difficult place for Guardiola himself and his ideas to conquer. The Italians are very much like, no, this is all fancy frippery. Like, football is about these basic things of your defenders should like defending and winning tackles, and your midfielders should do this and they should cover this amount of ground, and you have to kind of play in this way because this is what football is. These are the essential elements of it. And I wonder, and James, this is a genuine question to you, do you think the Italians look at it and think, all of that stuff is not really about the basics of the game. It's the basics remain the same whether you are passing it around and having 841 passes during the course of the game. You still have to win the second balls.
Yeah. I remember, Allegri, our favourite. I think this was whilst we were together, Rory. He said that he'd been for dinner with Italy's rugby coach or something.
Yeah.
And not a successful man. If you're Italy and you're coaching them in the Six Nations, you're going to get beaten all the time. But what Allegri seemed to come away from that dinner with was like a reminder of what he'd been taught as a player, which is, I think the rugby coach had basically took a piece of paper and he basically made 15 circles, and then a row of 15 circles, and then he put another row of 15 circles beneath them and basically said, right, your job here is to beat the circle in front of you. That's it. That's the game. And there is something extremely reductive about that. But aside
but it's
from
true, it is kind of true.
Well, it's true in a man marking system. I think in a zonal marking system, it's a bit more complicated than that. That's why zonal marking has taken over for man marking.
We are, as predicted, going off in some ridiculous tangent. But I think that there is a school of thought, and there has always been a school of thought, because even in England there has been a degree of resistance to the pretensions, the kind of, what's the word, like, how do you make something pretentious? Like that kind of over-intellectualisation of football that has been rooted in that idea that ultimately football is a team sport, but it's an individual competition. And if you get if the right winger gets the better of the left back, then that gives you a massive advantage in a game, and there's a decent chance that will win. And I think that remains. That's always been at the core of the kind of the insurgency against Pepism, against this idea that there is a right way of playing.
But even breaking it down like that, my question as a fundamentalist zonal marker would be. How on earth is he isolated? What's gone wrong that their right winger is isolating my left back? I don't want that happening. That's what so much of Van Gaal's philosophy. You spend any time with Louis Van Gaal, his whole thing is stop them getting one-on-one against you. He would tell his wingers, if it's one-on-one, take him on. But if you've got two people between you and the goal, turn back inside, recycle possession, try and create a one-on-one, try and create an overload, even better. So it's not untrue what you say. I just think that you don't actually have to go very high up the pyramid before it just doesn't really apply. Now, I think you can see cases, for instance, last Sunday, when it appeared Madueke had the beating of Kerkez, and Arsenal seemed weirdly reluctant to get the ball to him. Now, I don't know, partly because I haven't been back and watched the entire tape of what was a slightly dull game, and partly because I'm just not good enough at this. Was that Arsenal, because they have certain set ways of playing, set patterns of building up, they can't do that quickly. They can't suddenly change in-game. Because Arteta does seem, certainly from the outside, seems pretty prescriptive in what he asks his players to do. Is that on them, or is it on Liverpool because they've worked out a way to stop Madueke isolating Kerkez? And Arsenal do want to do that, but something goes wrong in the midfield because Liverpool have stopped it. As I say, I'm not good enough to know the answer to that, but that question feels to me quite key. And this issue of, is it about individual battles? No, obviously it's not. Or is it about team dynamics? Yes, obviously it is. That underlies everything. So this is what I think people who come to football late, or people especially who like American sports, where American sports is much more individualistic, even though the team game is, if you have a great individual, they can have an outsized influence over the game. I think it's what people get wrong about football. It's why I do a US newsletter for The Guardian, and one of the things we do every now and again is a mailbag.
Patronise them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that's more than every now and again, but we do mailbags, and got this question in saying, oh, yeah, Real Madrid have just won the Champions League and they've just signed the best player in the world, Kylian Mbappe. How can they possibly be stopped? And it never even occurred to me that signing Mbappe hadn't made them worse. Of course it made them worse. And it's one of those things where kind of a question is so sort of naive. It's sort of, oh, here's an assumption I've made, which I probably shouldn't have made, and I probably should explain why I made it. I was still right, but I should explain the heuristic that's led me to leap to that conclusion without really analysing the stages I've taken.
To drag us back towards the script, I think the one thing that is really interesting, even though there has been, as we say, there has always been a bit of resistance to the idea that there is a right way to play football. There have always been kind of avatars of this is ridiculous, whether that's Neil Warnock or the entire nation of Italy, people who have kind of remained loyal to pre-Guardiola principles. And this is a point you made, Jonathan, so I'm going to do the decent thing and allow you to make it rather than stealing it from you. Is the spread of Guardiola's basic ideas of that Spanish school has been incredibly widespread, and it has become incredibly dominant. That it has influenced football. It's not just the teams that Guardiola's coached. It's not just the coaches who've worked with him and then gone out to other places. It's every country that he's worked in. It's become the gold standard even in like South America. The Brazilians, there has always been that kind of temptation of, could we get Pep Guardiola to coach the Brazilian national side? If you look at like Qatar or another kind of emergent football culture, they will have a Spanish coach, and often they will have a Spanish coach because they want their team to play in that Guardiola style, because that is what they think elite football looks like. And they think that because for a long time that is what elite football has looked like.
It does feel like you made the point rather than like me make it, but still, yeah, that is correct, I think, and I think this is unprecedented. I think if you look at purely at the context of English football, Pepism, in all its manifold forms, has been a dominant mode such as we haven't seen since 4-4-2 or possibly even WM before that. But 4-4-2 wasn't globally dominant. Maybe it's a little bit more because of everybody still fundamentally in the pre or in the interwar period looked to English football. So maybe WM is the closest thing we had to this. But yeah, I certainly in recent memory there's been nothing, and by recent I mean post Second World War, there's been nothing so globally dominant as this is the way you play the game. And you look at people like Jorge Sampaoli, an Argentinian who just decided, right, I am a clone of Guardiola. I want to play Guardiola football, and very successful with Chile, or less successful with Argentina. He's done that in Spain. He's done that in Brazil. But he is a self-declared disciple of Guardiola. I don't think that's ever happened before. I don't think people were going around saying, I am a disciple of Don Revie, or I am a disciple of Herbert Chapman. And that's because of the international nature of the game, the way that, as Miguel will tell us repeatedly, wealth is accrued at the top, and that we have these de facto super leagues. The fact that players and managers move around so much now, it's become possible for this one idea of play to dominate. But what's fascinating is now we seem to have come or be in the final stages of that. It feels like it's coming to an end, and that's a position maybe even 5 years ago. You just sort of assume, this is the way we do it. Maybe Guardiola eventually will retire, but somebody else will come in. It'll still be Pepism. And maybe it won't be. I mean, I guess to what extent the forms of football we're seeing springing up are Pepism, to what extent they're a development of Pepism, to what extent they're something completely new, we can debate. But it does feel we're in a period of flux now that we haven't been in for 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I think there is an element, and I'm not sure I can kind of express this in an eloquent way that would work on a podcast, but I think there is an element of there's a ship of Theseus quality to Pep, in that if you look at the way City have played for the last 2 or 3 years.
It's what our other contributors would call Trigger's Broom, because they're not as chin-strokey and wanky as us. Right. What was once Edison kind of passing starting a beautiful passing move that led to a false nine feeding Phil Foden or whatever, is now, or might this season might well be Gigi Donnarumma smashing it forward to Erling Haaland. Like, that is the arc of Manchester City's Guardiolismo, whatever you want to call it. So Pep, without question, has changed. He's adapted, and most of his adaptations have worked brilliantly, and he's pioneered all these different things. It's the inverted fullbacks. It's the Tony Pulis-esque 4 central defenders across the back. He's done all these things, and they mostly have worked. And I don't know at what point you say that is the
the growth and change and adaptability of Guardiola's thinking. It's the many schools of Pepism. Everything is Pepist. Everything Guardiola does is automatically Pepist. Or whether you can say that Guardiola himself has moved away from the core tenets of his dominant philosophy, which I think gives, is further proof to James's argument, really, that the issue with Guardiola has never been what he does. It's the fact that people seem to get frozen in time, determined to play a certain style of football that he himself has moved away from. But it does feel to me as though what we're seeing now is a direct kind of response to that. Guardiola's thinking, I would argue, was heavily influenced by Klopp. I think there was a point where the German school and the Guardiola school melded together and started borrowing a lot from each other. I think the high pressing intensity, that Bielsa style, Klopp style kind of pressing, I think was honed more in Germany, and Guardiola adopted it rather than Guardiola kind of pioneering it and the Germans taking it. But now it feels as though what we're getting is something that is distinct and is very hard to kind of credit to Guardiola, if that makes sense. And that could be, and he's made the point, I think, that like Andoni Iraola, he feels is a much more modern coach than him. Thomas Frank at Tottenham, it's hard to make the case that he is a Guardiola. He's obviously Guardiola influenced, as everyone is Guardiola influenced, but it's hard to make the case that he's a kind of direct descendant of Guardiola. It does feel as though, we're kind of awaiting. We're in a period of flux, James. Is that fair? Do you with your giant continental brain, do you sense that?
A little, even though we do see Pep disciples, people who've worked under him, striking out on their own, and other people, as Jonathan said, have just been influenced him. It's been striking to me to see the likes of Daniele De Rossi, De Zerbi, Maresca all go to Manchester with Alexander Kolarov for lunch and dinner with Pep, to learn from the great man. These kind of three Italians and a Serb. But in terms of like what the great leap forward is now, I don't have the kind of Pep, Saki, Rinus Michels vision. Otherwise, I'd be making 25 million a year coaching 23 footballers. But when Pep says that Iraola is the one who is driving things forward, or he said in the past that De Zerbi is doing, the thing that strikes me is that those coaches have kind of made names for themselves at smaller clubs where they've often got just the league to focus on. Maybe in Iraola's case, FA Cup, Carabao. Gotta love the Carabao. Whereas at the absolute pinnacle of the game now, because of the way the calendar is, Pep probably has no time to innovate. Pep is basically going from match to match, and we hear this all the time. I've always thought this. When Leicester won the title, remember Claudio Ranieri said it was down to basically recovery and not doing any training. But he was like, we don't have it. We don't have time. And I think certainly that's even more true now of your Man City, your Liverpool coaches. And I honestly don't know where tactically, beyond borrowing what has gone before, or the helix coming round, the feedback loop basically changing how managers approach games, and we just see the same things in different times. I don't know whether the next leap forward is just going to be even better fitness and conditioning. We've had Nagelsmann talking about kind of cognitive training for better decision making and all that sort of thing. It does feel like we're in a constant recycling. I'm not sure whether we will. And I don't want to go back to Allegri, who says you can't invent anything in football anymore. It's already been done. But it does feel like we've exhausted a lot, unless Wilson has some ideas.
Well, just before Wilson offers his ideas, I was going to say that one of the themes of the last week has been Thomas Tuchel, the England manager. England are playing, it's an international break. They played Andorra. It was fascinating. Talking about long throws are back, long ball from the goalkeeper is back. And it did kind of create this impression of this is a recycling, that we have effectively, or you can look around and see evidence to suggest that we've effectively gone back to football's prehistory, the 1980s, because you have an Arsenal team who are among the favourites for the title, who are, and I watched them against Liverpool and was really struck by the extent to which Arsenal's game plan revolved around set pieces. There was an awful lot of kind of expectation that Arsenal would be able to make the breakthrough in what was a very tight game from a set piece, and there is reason for Arsenal to believe that. The number of goals they've scored from corners in the last, whatever it is, 3 or 4 years is insane. It's almost twice as many as the next best team in the Premier League. You have coaches who are kind of focusing on signing or teams anyway, who are focusing on signing number 9s this summer. That's where the market has been. It's been in strikers, actual strikers, and maybe not kind of strikers in the sense of, big man, little man. You want a complete striker, what I would say is a post-Drogba striker. But it does feel as though the age of the false 9 has gone. You want an actual 9 who can score goals, whether it's Alexander Isak or Nick Voltemada or whoever it might be, Joao Pedro. They are players who can get much more involved with play than they might have done 20 years ago, but they are unquestionably strikers. They're not kind of repurposed midfielders. Napoli have gone out and just signed the tallest person they could find in Lorenzo Luca. It does feel, or it could feel, I think is maybe the better way of putting it, as though, to quote the noted anti-Libero activist Michael Cox, we are sort of regressing, if that's not too loaded a word, back to the age of the mixer. I wonder whether there is, you see people in stands with moustaches and wearing Manchester United shirts that say Sharp on the front. Are we drifting back to the 1980s, Jonathan?
I think.
Is it all cyclical? Is that what we're saying?
Don't say that word. Don't say that word. So my problem with the word cyclical is to me as, I don't know, it's like saying to James, the greatest living Italians are Stanley Tucci and Gianluigi Tifo, the man who invented fan displays. But the problem with the word cyclical is it implies that there's a predictable, we go winter, spring, summer, autumn, winter, spring, summer, autumn. That's a cycle. Football does not go WM 44, 433, 442, 352, WM and keep going round. It is absolutely true that elements of the past are being repurposed in the present. I think Allegri is probably right that football is such a mature sport, it's very hard to imagine something completely new exploding on us. The development, the evolution is going to be incremental. I think what happened in 2008, and we've touched on this often before, but the low background factors plus a once in 5 generation genius in Guardiola comes along who can exploit it. So actually there suddenly is a leap of a sort. I think I thought I wouldn't see in my lifetime. It did happen then. I can't believe it'll happen again. So I think where we are now, the analogy is with the decline of faith in the 19th century, that this thing that has shaped our thinking, that we hadn't even questioned. It was just the assumption this is how it is, Pepism. And suddenly you've got, I don't know, German philologists kind of going, actually, this translation of the Bible is not right. And hang on. And all these questions, all these doubts. And when faith goes, when this one sort of overriding philosophy is proved inadequate, or many people begin to feel it's inadequate, then you start grasping for other solutions. You start experimenting. Now, in the 19th century, that led to Nietzsche. It led to seances. It led to belief in fairies. It led to a whole load of kind of very disparate, very odd beliefs. And that's where we are in football now. The people are grasping after new solutions. But it's also, as Nietzsche says, it's actually a very sort of Darwin comes out of this culture. Once you start questioning, everything is suddenly up for grabs. And in that environment, it's a very insecure, unstable, slightly threatening world. And so if I'm not saying this is necessarily is happening. I am saying it's happening. I think this is what's going on now. There's people who sort of, there's all these different ideas. I don't know which ones to pick, and it all seems a bit frightening. Football's about scoring goals. What's going to score me goals? Alexander Isak. A big number 9. And so we've gone back to the absolute basics. The one thing we can rely on is number 9s who are quick, who are big, who can shoot, will score goals. And if they get you 20, 25 goals a season, you're going to finish in the top 6, top 8.
So I think that's probably right. There's probably a bit of an element of that. But to me, there is a kind of there's a story running concurrently with the rise and potential fall of Pepism, and that's the rise and potential fall of data, I suppose. As you mentioned about the pitches, Jonathan, I think football is far more susceptible to kind of to its ecosystem than we think. We think that the game drives everything, but in reality, a lot of the time, it's kind of technology changes the game, or the kind of the environment in which it's being played changes.
Diet,
the game.
nutrition, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, all that stuff. But right down to the reason that English football has a long ball tradition is because it rains a lot here. For, I don't know, 70, 80, 100 years, the pitches were mud baths in the winter. You're not passing it on a mud bath. You know, this is the point that you make about Guardiola. Like, you can't play beautiful passing football very easily when the ball sticks constantly because it's muddy. So that obviously the English and the German traditions in football are much more direct than they are in the kind of, you know, the kind of sun-drenched Italian and Spanish plateaus. I don't know, whatever they have in Spain and Italy. You know, they're playing it's hotter, so they play slower. The surface is drier, so you can play it on the ground. It's probably a bit bumpier, so their technique gets better. Whereas in England and Germany, smash it forward, get it over the mud. And I wonder whether there is a point at which a lot of the kind of stuff that we've seen tactically in the last 20 years can be at least tacked onto, if not directly traced to the rise of data. And this is, you know, just as you've written books, I've written books, and I might want to make sure that the things that they're about are relevant. But if you look at, you know, the decline of crossing, and there was like a noted decline of crossing, a lot of that was attributed to the fact that Guardiola didn't really want his players kind of whipping crosses in. He maybe not pioneered, but he was a big advocate of kind of inverting those wingers. But also, according to data analysts, you'd say that crossing's quite a low percentage thing. Like, it's quite hard to score a goal from a cross. So they don't encourage teams that listen to the data to cross the ball particularly, or they certainly haven't. Set pieces, I think, are fascinating because initially the read was that corners particularly are a really low percentage way of scoring. Like, corners are really inefficient. And I think initially a lot of teams looked at them and thought, okay, you don't have to emphasise corners that much, take them short, retain possession, work a shooting opportunity, do the Guardiola thing. There seems to me to have been a second wave of thought on that, which says that if they're inefficient, they're low-hanging fruit, make them more efficient and you'll score loads of goals, which I think is what Arsenal have done. They've basically said this is an area where we can, if we improve by 5%, we will have a massive competitive advantage on everybody else. Let's hire Nicholas Jova. Let's get them all to run from the back post. Let's have 6'4" central defenders. And they've turned that into a weapon. So I wonder to an extent whether what we're seeing is that just as pretty much every team in the Premier League now, I'm sure, has a specialist set-piece coach, they all have loads of data analysts. And I wonder if what the data is telling them is that your game model should be much less about dominating the ball in sterile areas and more about getting the ball to the dangerous areas relatively quickly. Not quite Charles Reap, Charles Hughes, Pomo, but something not unrelated to it.
But we've seen that with PSG and Newcastle, haven't we? With like kind of kickoffs, which are almost like rugby players finding touch to then get yourself set in a high press, almost as a set piece high press, and then win it back and basically create situations from those. I also think, you know, to come back to my point about time to implement, let's say, complex game models. Yeah, set pieces take a lot of time, but it's low intensity work. It's something that you can do, I suppose, between recovery. You know, really, and you're not having to put. I think the kind of mental expectation or exertion that comes with, you know, all of the complexities that we've seen in other game models. It's slightly different when it comes to say, right, we're just going to spend a few hours doing set pieces between your recovery sessions, and they're maximizing that so that they can, still have the players to play as close to 100% on a match day and have something extra if things don't come off in open play, which, as we've seen with so many of these field tilt, play in the opponent's half, the top teams coming up more and more against teams that have low blocks, you know, the set play is going to be the way of okay, if we can't play through the low block, let's get a corner and put more into that.
I think at that point we'll take a break, just so we can give you all a breather, and we will come back and we will discuss this further, because I want to pick up on James's point about low blocks, which I know everyone is fascinated by. welcome back to the second, slightly shorter half of Libero. James, I wanted to pick up on something you said, and it kind of ties in really with what we talked about in the globalisation of Pepism. That would logically follow then that there has been an equally globalised, like, immunity to Pepism among smaller teams. I wrote about Nigeria at the weekend and their struggles in qualifying for the World Cup, and the final beat of that piece was something that Jonathan actually echoed when we were discussing it in our WhatsApp group. We're really cool. We were talking about African World Cup qualifying in our own WhatsApp group. We're exciting individuals. And there's various issues around Nigeria and coaching and infrastructure and kind of mismanagement from the Nigerian FA. But the point that Jonathan made, and I think he's right, is that the smaller African nations are now much better than they used to be. They have improved considerably, so that Benin are second in that group. Nigeria are third, South Africa are top. Until the weekend, Rwanda were ahead of Nigeria. That's partly Nigeria's failings, but it's partly Rwanda and Benin getting a lot better, a lot more professional. They are able to win football matches in a way they maybe wouldn't have been 30 years ago.
Getting money from being on the sleeves of Premier League clubs, Rwanda.
Exactly.
Or something.
Or just the inspiration of... the Rwandans had Bakary Sagna and Luis Garcia at some event this weekend as representatives of Arsenal and Atletico, the Rwanda football network, which I thought was just a great thing to see Paul Kagame up there with these two. I mean, that is a little bit low rent getting Luis Garcia and Bakary Sagna, but that's different. But that same thing's happened everywhere. That the middle classes now, or even the lower middle classes of football, the traditionally smaller teams, they can shut a game down really effectively. Andorra only conceded 2 to England, which I know that everything that came out of that game was, this is pointless, isn't it boring, it's terrible that we should have to watch this, it's not entertaining. Andorra going to Villa Park and losing 2-0 is a pretty good result for Andorra, to be perfectly honest. That's quite impressive. So I wonder to an extent whether the increasing reliance on set pieces, on playing fast, on exploiting any kind of glimmer of disorganisation in the opponent, is because if you let even a relatively poor team get settled into their 2 banks of 4 or whatever, they're pretty good at shutting you down.
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, African football is where I think this has been most obvious, probably. My sense in 2002 with Senegal getting to the quarterfinal, second African team to get to the quarterfinal after Cameroon in 1990. And we'd had Nigeria won the Olympics in 96, Cameroon had won the Olympic gold in 2000. There was this sort of rising tide of African football that was almost inevitable, that they would start regularly getting to quarterfinals, semi-finals, maybe even more. And that hasn't happened at all. And I've been to, 11 Cups of Nations now? And I don't think the winners of those Cups of Nations have got any better. You know, I think Cameroon, who won my first Cup of Nations in 2002, were as good as the Ivory Coast team who won it last year. But what has happened is that, so the pyramid hasn't got any higher, but it has got a lot broader based. Yeah, and the effect of that is, if you're a good side, if you're a team who really wants to impose yourself, there is no margin for error. You can't make mistakes. Mistakes will be punished. You've got to be on it. And if you're as disorganised as Nigerian football has been for decades, let's be honest, then just the weight of... Nigeria used to do quite well in African football because it's a huge country. It's the most populous country in Africa. And, it's got a football tradition. That used to be enough to win you regular Cups of Nations. Well, now it's not. Now, we've had Cups of Nations where Nigeria haven't even qualified. And I think we're seeing that in this World Cup cycle, that Nigeria face a massive game against South Africa on Tuesday. Senegal, who are, for me, are by far the best team, maybe with Morocco, but by far the best 2 teams in Africa at the moment. Senegal have got a massive game in Kinshasa against DRC, and if they lose that, they're going to be scrabbling around for a playoff. And those playoffs are brutal. There's only 4 teams in them from Africa for one place to go into the Intercontinental playoff. So Senegal might miss out. And that's obviously very good in some ways for African football, in that it means that you can't just doze your way through. But it also means that the teams who get to the World Cup might not be the ones who can put up the best showing. But coming back to the actual point, yes, if you're up against a team, like big physical team sitting in a low block, and you maybe don't quite have the couple of creators or the slickness built up by being able to practice together day after day after day for weeks, then set plays are a great way.
Or the quality that Guardiola had available. That's the other thing, isn't it? That and this isn't a slight on Guardiola at all, but he was always working with the best players in the world. If you're one of his imitators, not only, and that sounds pejorative, it's not really meant to, but if you're a team who, a coach who would describe himself as a disciple of Guardiola, you're probably not as smart as him, you're not as able to react to specific challenges as he is, and your players are probably a bit worse. And if you're suddenly up against a really well-organised sort of defensive team, happy to sit there, catch you on the break, your kind of beautiful tiki-taka, intricate passing mandala probably won't work. So you're increasingly likely, as a club, as a coach, even as an individual player, to think the way to make that breakthrough is to maximise things like set pieces, things like, oh, the left back's suddenly out of position, we go there, we hit that, we punch that bruise as quickly as we can. So I wonder if that's making football, if the future of football isn't an overarching tactical vision or an overarching philosophy as it was with Guardiola, but is actually much more about kind of opportunism and isolated opportunities to score a goal.
But I sort of think that's how football was. I mean, am I missing anybody? But essentially between... Maybe you could say what was going on at Barcelona was slightly different, but basically between Saki and Guardiola, that's how football was. If you talk to Rafa, he's not talking about a sort of overarching vision. He's very good at, you present him with a situation and he tells you what the team's done wrong or what they've done right. It's very much he's very good on the details. He's very good at specific situations. It's not a philosophy. I don't think Rafa Benitez is a philosophy manager. Now, he learned from Saki. He went to see him in Milan. You're very good friends with Francisco Maturana, the Colombian coach, who's also a sort of Sakiite who redeveloped those ideas for the Colombian market. But they both seem to me, I mean, we talk a lot about pragmatists and idealists. They sort of, I mean, I think Guardiola is actually a pragmatist. I don't think Guardiola is really a Pepist, if you like. I think he does what he thinks will win games. It's others who've taken it on as a philosophy and some of the language he uses. But Benitez, Maturana, they're much more about, those are good ideas, I can apply them in my circumstance.
Well, I think you can probably draw a parallel between Benitez and Thomas Frank, can't you? I mean, they are. Thomas Frank is I would say, and I say this as someone who really likes Rafa, is certainly more like emotionally intelligent. I suspect his mastery of psychology is greater. He has a more obvious charisma and he's got much better hair. But I think in terms of
savage.
Sorry, Rafa. I think in terms of what they think their job is as a manager, probably quite similar, to be honest. Rafa will. The Juve first leg of the Champions League quarter-final. Capello's Juve played in a certain way, and Rafa worked out that he would have sent people to watch Liverpool. They'd have watched all the tape of Liverpool. That's the other thing, that everyone knows what everyone is trying to do at all times. That is the other thing that kind of is the great equaliser, that even if you're 18th in the Premier League, if you're Sunderland, you know exactly what Arsenal are going to try and do to you. The test is whether you can stop it. But Rafa knew that Juve would have watched everything. So he set up his team to play for the first 5 minutes of that quarter-final in a 4-2-3-1, and after 5 minutes just switched it. And he did it. It was purely and simply, I think this probably happens quite a lot, it was just a decoy. It was, you think we're going to do this? Actually, no, we're going to pull the striker. I can't remember who was playing up front, maybe Milan Barros. We're going to pull the striker back, we're going to play 4-5-0. 4-6-0, and that's what we're doing. And it was purely and simply because he knew he had to try and kind of just confuse Juventus a little bit, because they knew everything about Liverpool, just as Liverpool knew everything about them. And I think Thomas Frank is probably cut from the same cloth. There is no overarching philosophy, so he'll change formations in the middle of a game because it works better, or because he can see the opposition understand that's what they were anticipating. So there's no benefit in playing that way. Maybe we are entering basically a godless phase. That there is no kind of overarching philosophy. There is no right or wrong way. There is just the game, and you adapt within the moment.
Yeah, but I think that's why Carlo Ancelotti is the most successful coach of this century. Okay, he's maybe not been as influential as Pep. We're not talking about Carloism, but ultimately Ancelotti understands that. I mean, there was a clip of him, I think in his last season at Madrid, where he laid out his principles, which were essentially to make sure that when the team lost the ball, there was at least some order in disorder. So you get back into shape, And if you don't win it back, you make sure that you're not going to get transitioned or counted on, blah, blah, blah. And look, I've always sort of railed against this idea that Carlo doesn't have a plan. He just leaves it all to improvisation. That's not true, particularly if you look at some of his books where he spends chapters and chapters basically saying, look, here are the diagrams of what I cooked up for this game in this time. But he is willing to kind of let the players improvise in a way that, if you look at Pep with Jack Grealish, for example, Grealish, I think, came out and said he wanted more freedom. And Pep was very much kind of like, no, when we have the ball, you have to be in this position for what we've got planned to work. Whereas Carlo is very much like, look, if Rodrigo and Vinicius want to play next to each other on the left-hand side because they feel in that moment in the game that they can combine, get a numerical advantage on that side, we can overload and we can affect something meaningful there, then I'm going to let them do it. I'm not going to shout on the sideline and basically say, no, that's not what we had planned. You should be in this position when the ball is there. And I think, for me, as much as we've said that teams know more about each other than they ever have before, and the kind of margins for basically getting one over an opponent is ever slimmer. I do think that's why you will still hear Pep Guardiola and Carlo and the others say it's a player's game, because ultimately the players, it comes from creativity, their reading of a situation in a moment to make the difference, if we can't do it on a set piece.
And I think what's really telling about that, and it's one of Guardiola's great gifts, but the problem is always the imitators. Just as, Alf Ramsey gets a whole load of flack for what his imitators did. But Guardiola is probably, in terms of space and positioning, the greatest genius we've ever known in football. Maybe Cruyff, but certainly in the last 50 years, the greatest genius we've seen. I don't think his interpersonal skills are great. I think a lot of his players find him quite odd. And in the same way you mentioned about the difference between Benitez and Frank. And I think because he's been the model for so many people, because the data is so specific, because we do know what everybody's going to do or teams know what everybody's going to do at every given moment, because they've watched hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of videos, there's this sense of perfectibility that you create your algorithmic plan for how you're going to approach a game. And what I think has slightly been lost from the game is what English football used to prioritise above all else, was the motivational capacities of a manager, the capacity of a manager to smell the emotional, psychological context of a game. And I keep coming back to this as the best example I remember of this. And it's of a manager I don't particularly rate very highly. But when Manchester United lost that Champions League last 16 tie, was it 2019, against PSG. They lost 2-0 at home. They went to Paris. They're 2-1 up at half-time, which feels vaguely miraculous. And the sort of the thing you expect Ole Gunnar Solskjaer to do is to say, attack, go and get the third goal. That'll take us through in away goals. Because away goals still count then. And he doesn't. He says, no, we hold it. It's the same as George Graham did at Anfield in 89. We hold it because they will get nervous in the last quarter of an hour, and particularly PSG. And you've got two things going on there. You've got United, who always score late in key games. You've got Ole Gunnar Solskjaer standing there, the man who's the physical manifestation of that. And you've got PSG, who always wilt. And so United do nothing for half an hour in that second half. PSG sort of, hang on, this is fine. We're 3-2 up. Doesn't matter. 75 minutes, United suddenly attack, and PSG are like, they can't reset. They haven't played for half an hour. They're panicking. They concede a penalty, bit of a soft penalty, bit of a VAR penalty, but it's a penalty. Rashford scores. United go through in away goals with this implausible 3-1 win because Solskjaer smelled the psychological energy of the game. And I think that's been lost a bit because everybody is so obsessed with the idea that numbers, stats, research can explain the game. And of course it can, but that intuition, that emotional intuition, and what I found really revealing on last Sunday, Fabian Hurtzler having made that quadruple substitution after 61 minutes against City, which completely changed that game, he said, I just felt it inside me. That was his explanation of it. He was asked repeatedly in the press conference afterwards, why did he make that change? What was it that made you do it? I felt it inside me. And then he was, of course, we discussed it with the coaching staff. It wasn't just me. But it's sort of like, well, that's what coaches used to do. They used to feel it inside them. Of course, the intuition doesn't come from nowhere. It's built up over years. I mean, not that many years in case of Fabian Hürzeler, but it's built up, their knowledge of a game from watching it, from playing it, from coaching it, from experiencing it. But it's still fundamentally a capacity to sniff for psychological energy. And that, I think, is something that Pepism has devalued.
I'd maybe make the case, this is now taking it off on a really weird tangent. I wonder to what extent video games are responsible for that to an extent as well, that they've taught us that not only do managers have the ultimate power, that there's some sort of overseeing authority guiding the game, but they've made us think algorithmically. Like, if I put this player in my team gets better. This player has this level of this attribute at this level, therefore the combination increases my chances of winning. And I think a lot of the time it's not like that. But I remember, I can't remember who it was, talking to someone about Harry Redknapp, who again is not a manager who I would be like, there should be a Redknapp school of football. But it was at that peak of the kind of philosophy years, saying that, Redknapp didn't really do data, wasn't really interested in kind of a style of play, that a lot of his training sessions were like, you do a bit of a warm-up, then you have a kick around. That was kind of Harry Redknapp's training sessions. But he had this ability to pick a team that had a really great natural balance. And it's not that it was said as a criticism, but I remember even at the time thinking, it's probably quite a useful skill to have as a manager, that, isn't it? To understand automatically that if you put Luka Modric here and this player there, that all kind of works nicely together. And that's through spending a life in football. And I think this is touching on a subject that we've discussed before, but I do wonder to what extent we've kind of talked ourselves away from quite a lot of the basics into overlooking the importance of that sense of football that the best managers always had. And now it will all be reinforced by data or by analyst research or by the fact that, you can say, well, this team does this because we've watched their last 20 games and we see that this is their strong suit or their weak point. But a lot of it probably does come down to like an innate knowledge of, okay, this feels like the sort of occasion where we need to do that. And maybe that kind of bears out Horny's admiration for Ancelotti, because Carlo seems to have that ability to do that much more. That's much more central to his style of management than this is what you have to do in any given situation. Because my approach is didactic and it is prescriptive, and my vision comes first.
It might even be to do with the devaluing of cup competitions as against leagues. That in leagues you probably do need something pretty formulaic, pretty reliable. Cups sniffing the moment, and Ancelotti's record in cups is sensational. His record in leagues is a bit more ordinary.
Yeah, although I do feel, again, these echoes of kind of late stage 90s, early 2000s Serie A that we see in the Premier League today. I think some of the coaches that have not won the Premier League title but are clearly really good coaches can maybe point to Ancelotti and say, just the league's bloody hard to win. I think that was true of Carlo when he was at Parma and AC Milan and Juventus, as it's true of Arteta at Arsenal at the moment, or Pochettino when he was at Spurs.
He did fail to win the French league with PSG, but yeah.
There's one final thing I just wanted to touch on before we allow everyone to get on with their lives. If we think that what we've discussed is true, if we think that kind of set pieces are of increasing importance, that there isn't an overarching kind of philosophical approach to football at the moment, does that make it, do we think, a sport more based around isolated events? Are we seeing the eve of a game that is a little bit less fluid, a little bit where the set play, whether that's a corner or a free kick, or whether like Horny says, like it's a press trigger from kickoff, so you get it into a position where you can press. Is it Sarri's football does that as well, doesn't it? It kind of encourages, you basically entice the other team to press so you can get them where you want them. Are we seeing football change in some way in its nature so it becomes more kind of driven by isolated instances that you can control?
Well, I think there's definitely an urge from a certain constituency of coaches to make it more structured, looking again at American sports, which I think are much more structured, and trying to apply that. I'm not convinced. I think football is such a fluid game. I'm not convinced that would be universally successful, but I think that's certainly one of the avenues. Basically, we've walked down an incredibly broad boulevard. We're now in the plaza of opportunity, and there are several avenues leading off this, and that is one of those avenues.
James, I kind of want to give you a chance to have the last word, but I just feel as though we trailed this episode by saying this was the smuggest, most chin-strokey lineup. I think talking about the plaza of opportunity might be the perfect way to end it.
Yeah, I'm sat in the coffee house next to in the plaza of opportunity with Wilson, so touching my beard,
touching your beard, wondering what's going to happen next. Thank you so much to James and to Jonathan. Thank you to producer Tom. Leave us a like, a review, a rating, whatever it is on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple, anything at all is greatly appreciated. The others will be back later in the week ahead of the return of the Premier League. Thank the Lord. Thank you for listening. We'll see you soon.